Marcus Ellison had never flown first class in his life. He was a 38-year-old electrician from Cleveland, Ohio, a single father, raising his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, on a salary that barely covered rent, groceries, and the occasional small joy he could offer her. That Tuesday morning, he had scraped together every last dollar from 3 months of overtime work, just to buy 2 economy tickets to Atlanta, where Lily was scheduled for a specialized surgery to correct a heart defect she had been born with. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of small moments to change lives, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness True Stories. Also, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Marcus had not slept in 2 days. His eyes were red, his hands were rough from years of manual labor, and his worn jacket had a tear along the left shoulder that he had sewn back together with mismatched thread. He held Lily's small hand as they settled into their seats near the back of the plane, and she looked up at him with those big brown eyes and said, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" He smiled and said, "We're always going to be okay, baby." He believed that with everything he had. The flight from Cleveland to Atlanta was supposed to be 2 hours and 20 minutes. About 40 minutes into the journey, when the cabin had settled into that quiet hum of cruising altitude and most passengers were watching movies or dozing off, everything changed in a single terrible moment. A sharp cry came from the front of the plane, followed by the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the floor. Flight attendants rushed forward. Passengers craned their necks. Lily gripped her father's arm and whispered, "What happened, Daddy?" Marcus stood up slowly and looked toward the commotion. A large man in his late 60s had collapsed in the aisle near the first-class section. His face was ashen, his lips were turning blue, and his body was convulsing slightly. The lead flight attendant's voice came through clearly over the rising panic. "Is there a doctor on board? We need medical assistance immediately." Silence. 10 seconds passed. 20. Nobody moved. Marcus watched as the man on the floor stopped moving entirely, and he recognized instantly what he was seeing. 3 years earlier, his own father had suffered a cardiac arrest in their family kitchen. Marcus had watched paramedics work on him that night and had later, driven by grief and helplessness, completed a full CPR and first aid certification course, so he would never feel that powerless again. He had never imagined he would need it like this. He looked at Lily, squeezed her hand, and said quietly, "Stay right here. Don't move. Daddy will be right back." Then he walked to the front of that plane with steady feet while everyone else stood frozen. He knelt beside the man, pressed 2 fingers to his neck, found no pulse, and immediately began chest compressions. His technique was textbook perfect. 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths, 30 more. He did not hesitate. He did not look around for approval. He just worked with a calm, focused intensity that silenced the entire cabin. One flight attendant retrieved the defibrillator from the overhead emergency kit and handed it to Marcus without a word, as if she somehow knew he was the right person to trust. He applied the pads, delivered the shock, resumed compressions, and after 4 of the longest minutes in that aircraft's history, the man on the floor gasped, then coughed, then breathed. Color slowly returned to his face like sunrise creeping across a pale sky. The cabin erupted into applause and tears. The flight attendants took over from that point, keeping the man stable and calling ahead to ensure medical personnel would be waiting on the ground. In all the chaos, Marcus quietly stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans, walked back down the aisle, slid into his seat beside Lily, and put his arm around her. "Is that man going to be okay, Daddy?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "He's going to be okay." She leaned her head against his arm and closed her eyes. Marcus stared straight ahead and said nothing more. When the plane landed and the doors opened, paramedics rushed in for the man who had collapsed. Passengers gathered around him, talking excitedly, some already filming videos on their phones. In all the noise and movement and relief, Marcus picked up their single carry-on bag, took Lily's hand, and simply walked off the plane. He did not speak to any flight attendant. He did not wait for a thank you. He did not tell anyone his name. He had a daughter who needed surgery and a taxi. He had already mentally budgeted down to the last dollar. He had no time for anything else. The man he had saved was Richard Calloway, founder of Calloway Global Industries, a man whose net worth exceeded $4 billion. When Richard woke in the hospital and asked who had saved his life, the flight attendants could only describe a quiet man in a torn jacket from the back of the plane. Richard's team reviewed footage from passenger phones and eventually identified Marcus through the airline's passenger manifest. What they found when they looked into his life broke Richard Calloway in a way that $4 billion had never been able to touch. A single father, a sick daughter, a surgery scheduled for the very next morning, a bank account with less in it than Richard sometimes left as a restaurant tip. Richard showed up at the hospital the following morning, before Marcus had even had his first cup of coffee, and stood in the waiting room with no entourage, no cameras and no prepared speech. When Marcus saw him, he said only, "I'm glad you're all right, sir." Richard could not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "You saved my life," and just walked away. Marcus shrugged and said, "You needed help. That's all there was to it." Richard arranged for every medical expense related to Lily's surgery to be paid in full. He set up a trust fund for her education. He helped Marcus start a small electrical contracting business with proper equipment and startup capital. He did not do it for publicity. He did it because a man with nothing had given him everything, and he understood finally what it meant to owe a debt that money could not fully repay. Lily's surgery was a success. She recovered beautifully. Marcus cried for the first time in years on the morning the doctors told him she was going to be perfectly fine. He sat alone in that hospital hallway, face in his hands, shoulders shaking, letting out every ounce of fear and exhaustion and love he had carried for 7 long years. Then he wiped his face, straightened up, and went in to see his daughter smile. The world is full of quiet heroes who will never trend on social media, never receive a trophy, and never ask for one. They just show up when it matters, do what needs to be done, and walk away. Marcus Ellison was one of those people. He did not save a billionaire. He simply saved a human being. And that made all the difference. If this story touched your heart, please show your love and support by liking this video, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribing to our channel Kindness True Stories, where every story reminds you that goodness still exists in this world and that ordinary people do extraordinary things every single day. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.